The logging chain was thick enough to anchor a boat, and it had been wrapped 3 times around a rusted steel post driven into the frozen ground outside a machine shed on the outskirts of Lloydminster, Saskatchewan. For the Belgian Malinois shivering against the corrugated metal wall, the war had not ended in the Panjwai District. It ended here, on the flat white expanse of the Canadian prairie, sold for $85 through an online surplus auction, 3 provinces away from the woman who had trusted him with her life. His name was Talon, or more precisely, his name was M07, a designation tattooed inside his right ear in green military ink. Military Working Dog M07, 2 Canadian Special Operations Support Regiment, trained in explosive detection and tactical patrol. He had completed 2 deployments to Kandahar Province, had confirmed 14 IEDs before anyone's foot came within range of them, and on a freezing October night in the Panjwai District, he had crawled into a partially collapsed compound interior after a close-quarters engagement and dragged a wounded Canadian Forces sergeant by the sleeve of her combat jacket, inch by inch, through broken concrete and rebar until the medevac team could reach her. The sergeant's name was Kandahar Dunstan. 3 ceiling beams had come down across her lower back when the compound wall failed, and she had gone in and out of consciousness for the 40 minutes it took Talon to get her to a point where human hands could take over. He had not left her side at the collection point. He had not left when the Griffon arrived. A corpsman had to physically carry him off the ramp. Now Talon was the farm dog. The distinction mattered to no one except Talon, who retained, in the precise amber geometry of his eyes, every instinct that had been built into him over 3 years of intensive training. He still scanned the perimeter when vehicles passed on the distant highway. He still lifted his nose into the wind and processed the information there with a thoroughness no human instrument could replicate. He was still, in every meaningful sense, on duty. His current owner, Douglas Harold Rennie, was not a cruel man. He was indifferent in the way that men who grow up around livestock sometimes become. Animals were functional, and when they stopped being functional, they became inconvenient. Rennie had purchased Talon at the online surplus auction because someone at his local co-op had told him a military-trained dog would keep the trespassers off his north field. He had not researched what a military working dog required to remain healthy. He fed him twice a day, sometimes once, and the kibble he bought was the cheapest available, a beige gravel of uncertain protein content that left Talon's coat dull and his weight visibly declining by October. The chain was functional. The machine shed provided partial windbreak. As far as Rennie was concerned, these were adequate arrangements. By January, Talon's hips had begun to go. Untreated bilateral dysplasia in a working dog was a particular kind of suffering. The inflammation built in layers, each cold morning worse than the last. Getting up from the frozen ground took him 20 seconds of visible effort. His eyes would close briefly at the peak of the effort, a small, involuntary acknowledgement of the pain, and then he would straighten and hold. He did not stop scanning. Every time a vehicle turned off the highway 2 kilometers to the south, Talon's ears pitched forward and his nose lifted into the wind. He was still waiting. He had never been given a different order. Kandahar Dunstan had been medically released from the Canadian Armed Forces 14 months after the Panjwai incident, the left side of her lumbar spine rebuilt with hardware, and a great deal of patience on the part of the physiotherapy team at the National Defence Medical Centre in Ottawa. She had submitted her first adoption request for Talon from a hospital bed, written by hand because she couldn't yet sit upright long enough to use a laptop comfortably. She had submitted 5 more over the following year, each one acknowledged with a form letter, and then, apparently filed in a place where nothing was ever retrieved. The desk officer at CanSoftCom who processed her 3rd request was a major named Gordon Eakins. Major Eakins had stamped the file with a 4-word handwritten note, await confirmation of availability. He had done nothing further. By the time Kara was mobile enough to attend in-person appointments and press the matter with any force, Talon had been transferred out of the system entirely. A private security firm in Alberta called Coastal Guard Services had taken him under a contracted working dog program. When Kara called Coastal Guard Services, a woman at reception explained that the company was not at liberty to discuss asset dispositions. When Kara retained a lawyer and filed an ATIP request, she received 42 pages of redacted documents and one visible sentence. Unit M07 surplus listed and disposed of via approved third-party auction, June 14th. She had stood in her kitchen in Petawawa, holding those 42 useless pages for a long time without saying anything. That had been 18 months ago. Since then, she had filed 2 additional ATIP requests and hired an Edmonton woman who specialized in locating lost military animals. She had driven to 3 separate addresses, one in northern Ontario, one outside Montreal, one in rural Quebec, to check dogs that turned out to belong to someone else. She had spent more evenings than she could account for scrolling through working dog rescue groups on Facebook. She had not given up. She was, as her former commanding officer had once written on an evaluation, constitutionally incapable of abandoning a task, once she understood its stakes. But she had, somewhere in the 18th month, quietly begun preparing herself for the possibility that she might never find him. She was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink when her phone lit up on the counter. The notification was from a Facebook group called Canadian Working Dog Sightings and Rescue. A woman named Trish Yamamoto had posted 11 minutes earlier. The post read, "Hey everyone. Drove through Lloydminster this afternoon on a delivery run and spotted a Malinois chained outside a machine shed on a rural property just off the Yellowhead. Thin, looked rough. Stopped to check on him, but the property owner came out and told me to keep moving. Dog had some kind of marking inside his ear. Looked like green ink, looked official. Coat is dull, can see his ribs. Anyone rescue out that way?" There was a single blurry photograph taken through the windshield of a moving vehicle. The framing was imperfect. The focus was wrong. The dog in the frame was lean to the point of angular, his coat flattened against the cold, standing at the full extension of his chain with his face turned toward the road. Kara stopped breathing. She knew the angle of those ears. She knew the particular way he distributed his weight forward when something had his full attention. She had memorized that posture across 2 years in the mountains of Kandahar. She could read it the way other people read a known face in a crowd. She called Brennan Quayle before she had consciously decided to. Brennan Quayle picked up on the second ring from Kelowna, British Columbia, where he had been awake for reasons he didn't explain. He was a former JTF-2 Master Corporal, and he had the voice of a man accustomed to making decisions in compressed timeframes, flat, unhurried, completely present. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Send me the post." She sent it. 50 seconds of silence. "That's his ear set," Brennan said. His voice had shifted into a register that Kara recognized from the field. "Not urgency exactly, certainty. That's him. I'm calling Reel and Harper. Be ready to drive by midnight." She told him she was already packing. Reel Fortin had spent 8 years with the Special Operations Component before a catastrophic knee injury ended his operational career. He drove to meet Kara at a Tim Hortons outside Portage la Prairie, arriving at 4 in the morning with a hard-sided equipment case and 2 coffees from the drive-thru. He handed her one without a word and got in the passenger seat. That was the entirety of the conversation about logistics. Harper Sabo had been working as a trauma nurse in Saskatchewan since her release, and she arrived at the designated meeting point outside Lloydminster with a trauma kit in a soft cooler that could, in her own words, manage a hemothorax in a parking lot if it came to that. She had driven 3 hours in the dark, and showed up with a calm expression that bore no relationship to the speed she had maintained on the highway. Brennan had chartered a single-engine aircraft from Kelowna and landed at the Lloydminster airport at 7. He brought the satellite imagery, printed on A3 paper, which he unrolled across the hood of Kara's truck in the parking lot of a gas station 4 kilometers from the property. "Main structure is the farmhouse here," he said, tracing the outline with his finger. "Machine shed on the north side, approximately 30 meters away. One vehicle registered to Douglas Harold Rennie, 61 years of age, no criminal record. Mixed grain and cattle operation. Far enough from the highway that a noise complaint is not an immediate concern." "Fence line?" Kara asked. "5-wire agricultural. It's not going to slow us down." "If Rennie comes outside?" Harper asked. "We talk to him. We're transparent. We explain the situation. We offer to compensate him. We do this clean." Kara looked up from the map. "He didn't know what he was buying. We're not treating him like an enemy." Nobody discussed what happened if clean wasn't available. It wasn't necessary. They crossed the property at 8:47 in the morning, moving through knee-deep snow in single file along a fence line 200 meters from the shed. The temperature was -19, the sky was white and flat, and the light was directionless. Kira was in front, and she was the first to see him. Talon was lying against the base of the shed wall, with his legs folded beneath him, his muzzle resting on the frozen ground. He looked smaller than she remembered. His ribs were visible through his coat at 30 meters. The chain around his neck had worn the fur away in a thin ring, leaving a stripe of reddened, chapped skin. He had not heard them yet. The wind was wrong, and in his stillness he looked like something that had learned to conserve every resource it had left. Kara stopped walking. Brennan touched her shoulder once, briefly. She exhaled. Then she walked forward across the last stretch of snow, alone until she was close enough to see the rise and fall of his breathing. "Talon," she said. His head came up so fast it looked involuntary. His ears moved forward like a reflex, like the sound of her voice had bypassed every intervening month and struck something that had been waiting at full attention in the dark this entire time. He did not growl. He did not bark. He lurched upright with the effortful, painful scramble of a dog whose hips had been left untreated through a prairie winter, staggering once before he caught himself, and then he drove forward against the chain with everything he had left in him. The sound he made was not something Kara had a name for, not a whimper, not a howl, but something with grief in it and relief in it, and the specific quality of a creature that has waited so long it had almost stopped believing the wait would end. It broke open in the cold air, and then dissolved into short, frantic sounds as he pushed his muzzle against her hands, her jacket, her face, confirming with his nose what his ears had already told him. Kara dropped to her knees in the snow and put her arms around him. He collapsed against her chest, all 80 pounds of him, his tail moving in short, unsteady arcs. He licked the side of her jaw. He licked the scar above her left eye, the one she had earned on the same night he had dragged her out of the rubble, and she made a sound she hadn't made in a very long time, pressing her face into the side of his neck and holding the back of his head with both hands the way she had in Afghanistan on every cold night between patrols, the way that had always meant, "I have you. We're still here." "I'm sorry," she said against his fur. Her voice was unsteady. "I'm sorry it took this long." Brennan arrived beside them and knelt quietly with the bolt cutters. The padlock was a basic hardware store model, and it sheared in a single motion. The chain dropped into the snow. Talon shook his head twice, then looked up at Kara and sat automatically at attention. His amber eyes were fixed on her face. "Stand easy," she said softly. They were 20 meters from the vehicles when the farmhouse door opened. Doug Rennie came out in a down vest and work boots, holding a coffee mug, wearing the expression of a man who has glanced out his kitchen window and seen something that doesn't quite register. He looked at the 4 people in his yard. He looked at the chain lying empty in the snow. He went back inside without a word. He returned 30 seconds later without the coffee mug, and with a lever-action rifle cradled in his arm. And behind him in the doorway stood a farmhand named Ray Krask, who was holding nothing but taking stock of the situation with focused attention. "That's my dog," Rennie said. His voice was not panicked. He had dealt with trespassers on this land before. "I paid for him. You're on private property." Kara did not raise her hands. She did not step back. She had stood in enough uncomfortable places with enough people holding weapons to understand the difference between a man who was about to use one and a man who was making a point. Doug Rennie was making a point. "His name is M07, she said, her voice level and unhurried. He served 2 tours in Kandahar Province with the 2 Canadian Special Operations Support Regiment. He was surplus listed and auctioned, without the proper military working dog adoption protocol being followed. I submitted 6 adoption requests over the course of a year while I was recovering from injuries in hospital. None of them were actioned. The failure was not yours, but he should never have reached that auction." Rennie's expression shifted fractionally. He hadn't known any of that. Brennan stepped forward and extended a white envelope at arm's length. $2,500, cash. You're being compensated fairly for an animal that was sold to you under circumstances that are now under legal review. You take the money, and we take the dog, and whatever you decide to do after that is your business." Rennie looked at the envelope for a long moment. He looked at the dog, who was standing pressed against Kira's leg, with his amber eyes fixed on Rennie's face. Not threatening, simply watching, with the calm, steady gaze of an animal that had already made its assessment and returned its attention to the person beside it. He was half useless in the cold anyway, Rennie muttered. He walked across the snow and took the envelope. He glanced once at Kira, briefly, with an expression that might have been something close to discomfort, then turned and walked back to the house. He said something to Krask, and they both went inside. The door closed. Kara let out a breath that seemed to have been held for 2 years. Harper had the rear cargo area of her SUV arranged before they reached the vehicles. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, unhurried, precise, palpating lymph nodes, running a thermometer, assessing the wear patterns on the paw pads, gently flexing each hip joint while Talon lay still and allowed it. She started a warm saline drip through a catheter in his foreleg and hung the bag from the grab handle above the window. Within minutes, the rigid shaking in Talon's muscles began to ease. He pressed his muzzle into Kara's lap and closed his eyes. "Core temperature is 35.1, Harper said without looking up. "Both hip joints are significantly inflamed. You're looking at moderate to advanced dysplasia. He's lost roughly 8 kilograms. His dentition shows he's been chewing on something hard for an extended period, probably the chain, which has fractured 2 lower molars." She paused, listening to his heart through her stethoscope. "But cardiovascular response is strong. He's a fighter." "He doesn't know how to be anything else," Kara said. They drove east as the winter sun climbed the white Saskatchewan sky. Talon slept against Kara's leg for 2 hours without stirring. She kept her hand on his ribs the entire time, feeling the steady rise and fall. In Saskatoon, an emergency veterinary clinic confirmed the dysplasia and malnutrition, prescribed an anti-inflammatory protocol and a managed exercise program, and photographed the M07 tattoo for the medical file. The veterinarian, a composed woman named Dr. Priya Hollander, reviewed the radiographs for a long time before she spoke. "He's going to need hip management for the rest of his life," she said. "But he's stable, and he's clearly been waiting for something specific to get better for." Talon, for the duration of the appointment, allowed no one to approach him when Kara left the room. He sat beside the door and waited with the unhurried certainty of someone who had learned that the people worth waiting for always came back. The drive home took 3 days. They stopped often. Kira's lawyer, a retired JAG officer named Aldrich Penn, who had built the second half of his career on veterans' advocacy cases, had already been briefed by phone and was, in his measured way, furious. Aldrich Penn did not operate quietly. He filed a formal complaint with DND's Director of Military Working Dog Services, attaching Kira's 6 unanswered adoption requests, the partially redacted ATIP documents, and Harper's photographs from the property, the worn patch at Talon's neck, where the chain had abraded the skin, the visible ribcage, the cracked pad tissue from months on frozen ground. He then sent the complete package to 3 journalists. The story ran in the Globe and Mail on a Thursday. By Friday, it had been picked up by every major television network in the country. By the weekend, the Department of National Defence was receiving thousands of emails daily from Canadians who wanted a coherent explanation of how a decorated military working dog had been auctioned alongside surplus radios for $85. Major Gordon Eakins was removed from his position pending a conduct review. Coastal Guard Services faced an RCMP investigation into the disposal practices for military animals in their care. A parliamentary subcommittee formally requested documents from both the company and Kansofcom. 3 weeks after the initial story broke, DND issued a public statement acknowledging procedural failures in the adoption process for military working dog M07, confirming retroactive approval of Kira's original application and announcing a comprehensive review of working dog disposition protocols with reference to Canada's animal welfare obligations. Kira read the statement sitting at her kitchen table in Petawawa. Talon was asleep on the orthopedic mat Harper had shipped from Saskatchewan, his legs moving slightly with whatever he was dreaming. His coat already looked different, thicker at the shoulders, the dull flatness replaced by something that caught the light when he moved. He had gained 3 kilograms in a month. The official adoption certificate came by registered mail on a Tuesday morning. Kira held it for a long time before she set it on the table and reached down to scratch Talon behind the ear over the green M07 tattoo. He lifted his head and looked at her. "Relieved of post," she said quietly. "You're home." 11 months later, on a warm September afternoon on the north shore of Lake Ontario near Belleville, Kira threw a tennis ball along the waterline, and Talon went after it like he was 20 months old again, a ground-eating sprint, right hip canted slightly, but stride full, and his tail high, sand spraying under his paws as he hit the wet edge of the water. He snatched the ball from the surf, turned hard, and came thundering back up the beach. He dropped it at her feet and sat at perfect attention, ears forward, amber eyes fixed on her face. Kira knelt in the sand and pressed her forehead to his. "Good boy," she said softly. "We hold the line." Talon barked once, clean and bright, and the sound carried out across the water and disappeared into the open September sky. The bond between a handler and her dog does not expire when the paperwork does. It does not expire when the chain goes on, or when the bureaucrats stop returning calls, or when the months become too many to count without feeling the weight of them. Talon had carried the full cost of someone else's indifference through a prairie winter and waited, in the cold and the dark, for the person who had made him a promise. And Kira Dunstan had spent 2 years keeping it, one ATIP request at a time, one night drive at a time, one frozen field at a time, until she found him. Some promises are worth exactly that much effort. Most of them are.